to help you, to help all of us live with earthquakes. Having discovered that I was learning things about earthquakes, that much of the damage is preventable if we're willing to do it. Now, that said, we probably aren't willing to pay for preventing all of the damage, but we need to be able to figure out what it is that we can do. And I've been working on this for quite a while. In 2014, I had an extraordinary opportunity to work with the city of Los Angeles to actually start applying some of the stuff that I'd been learning through all of this research and learning from many colleagues. You know, there's a lot of great people working in the field. Many of them are a little less comfortable with public speaking than I am. I was saying one of the biggest differences, I've spent my career at Caltech. So I graduated from MIT, I came to Caltech to do my job. I've had a very long career not having to worry about anyone ever wanting to look at me, let alone try to talk to me, right? Going from that to Los Angeles City Hall was a stressful change. It was about as different as anybody could imagine. And a lot of what I see myself as doing is really being as a translator for a lot of my colleagues, because we have useful information. We have to figure out how to share it. So tonight I'm going to take you through a bit of how we look at earthquakes in Southern California, what we had learned about them, and how this fed into the mayor's project, and some of how we are looking to try and change some of these outcomes in Los Angeles. And in case I forget to say it later, just this project is really for all of Southern California. Mayor Garcetti wanted to take this on. I am really impressed with his courage or self-confidence, being willing to deal with an issue that isn't very popular. But it's also, we hope that this is something that'll be of use to everybody. And the report from the mayor is available on the mayor's website. Anybody can get it. And I'm happy to work with people to try and get towards more information. I've found myself pretty committed to the idea that I can get this information used and making a difference. I want to start by just reminding you where we are with respect to the rest of the country. This is what the USGS puts together as the National Seismic Hazard Map. Right? So I want to point out that red means really bad. We don't need to get more technical than that. And there's a lot of people in California that think, hey, it's not so bad where I am. It's not nearly as bad as LA and San Francisco, right? Being not as bad as LA and San Francisco still means you're worse than the rest of the country, right? And everywhere in California needs to be dealing with the consequences of earthquakes. It's only a relative matter that would let you say our place is not so bad. Right? So why do we live here? Well, the reality is that the faults are what make California, California. San Francisco Bay is there because the San Andreas Fault splits around those and runs up the peninsula, forming the bay. The Sierra Nevada mountains are here because of what's called the Sierra Nevada Frontal Fault, really inventive name. And of course, here in Southern California, the whole basins have been formed by the bend in the San Andreas. Oh, so if we go back to this picture, California is what it is because of the faults, right? And if we want to live here, we have to figure out how to live with earthquakes. There are hundreds of faults in California, and that can be a bit confusing. Which one should you be dealing with? Number one, don't worry about any individual one. We don't know which one will go in our lifetimes. And that's, I think, an important thing to understand about the risk. If you go back to this picture, where I managed to get rid of my titles, what you will see here is this is the sum of all possible earthquakes over, say, 100,000 years, divided down to give you a 30-year risk. But when we look at a 30-year risk, you know how we say your chance of an earthquake in 30 years? People think we know something about 30 years. We chose 30 years at the advice of OES because it's the length of most people's mortgages. And therefore a time frame in which people are making financial decisions. If you actually want to have coherent information, you need to go out to about 100,000 years. And the next 30 years are going to be a random subset of those 100,000 year periods. And this is actually a very fundamental problem. A 30-year period in California is never going to have no damaging earthquakes, but it might only be $100 million in damage over 30 years, right? It might be $1 trillion worth of damage over 30 years, and that's a random choice, right? So it makes it difficult for us to manage earthquakes on the human time frame. What you can do is say, I'm probably going to have a problem. There will probably be damaging shaking in Orange County in the next 30 years, and it might be really awful, and I should be aware of what faults I have. And if we do that, that was actually why I went through this, is to be able to then say, you look down here in Orange County, there are only a few really big faults. You've got the Newport-Inglewood Fault, which had an earthquake in 33. That makes it a lot less likely to have an earthquake right now. You've got the Palos Verdes Fault, you got the San Joaquin Fault, the Whittier Fault, the Elsinore Fault. You should probably be aware of those if they're near you, but the chances are they're not going to happen before you're dead, right? The San Andreas, on the other hand, is about a 2% chance per year. So except for the oldest members in this room, chances are it will happen in your lifetime. Right? In 30 years, we give it a 60% chance of having a big earthquake. It averages 150 years between earthquakes, and it's been about 330 since the last one. The good news is what's ever causing a long interval is happening right now. What I want to do is start showing you what this means. The San Andreas is such a likely earthquake that we've put a lot of effort into understanding what it is. It's not just really common, it's also, because it's such a long fault, that means it's the biggest earthquakes. So the San Andreas starts at the Salton Sea, runs up, it's this line up through here, goes up through the Bay Area, all the way up to Cape Mendocino. Now there's a middle portion of it that we don't think will have big earthquakes. We have about 350 miles in Southern California that we think could go all at once. That means it could have an 8.2. It's the length of the fault that controls the size of the earthquake. So let's take a minute to look at what a big earthquake is. Oh, okay. An earthquake happens because of sudden slip on the fault that releases shaking as one of its effects. At least that's the way a seismologist thinks of it. You probably think of the shaking as the earthquake. But that is a consequence of the movement of the fault. You are not feeling the movement of the fault yourself. It's in fact a lot like snapping your fingers. When you snap your fingers, I have two surfaces in frictional contact. I push hard enough to overcome the friction. It slips suddenly and releases energy in the form of a sound wave. And that wave travels from my fingers, well, to the microphone and amplified for the rest of you. When it slips on a fault, it has energy that goes out and travels across the region, and you feel it potentially quite a bit of ways from where the fault is. When you are near the fault, this is what it looks like. So here's a rice paddy actually in Japan that moved 6 feet during the earthquake, offsetting that. All right. We have had, as I said, we have hundreds of active faults. This is actually a way to see it a bit more clearly. Relatively speaking, Orange County is, especially southern Orange County, is in better shape, but you're surrounded by a lot of faults, so you're going to be getting it anyway. So I said we did a big study about what a big earthquake's going to be like. We created the shakeout scenario. And in this, we got hundreds of experts together. So we started from the basic geology. What is the fault like? And what's the most likely distribution as that fault moves? The seismology tells us what the waves are. The engineering tells us what the damage is. And then we went to the social sciences about what happens to our communities as the result of all of this. And the result we put together in a movie, and that's what I wanted to show here.
It's a sunny morning in Southern California. Across the region, 7.5 million people are busy at work, Several 100,000 of them are commuting to jobs in different counties, far from where they live. Over 200,000 commuters work and reside on opposite sides of the San Andreas Fault. Today, these families and many others across the region will be separated. 1,800 people will die. 53,000 people will be injured. And $213 billion in damage will occur. It's 10 a.m. The largest earthquake to hit Southern California in modern times has just begun. Some people react appropriately, others don't. In the intense shaking, nearly 1,500 buildings collapse. Infrastructure is severely compromised, and 300,000 buildings suffer significant damage. The rupture travels 200 miles northwest along the San Andreas Fault, violent shaking lasting as long as 2 minutes in some areas. Finally, the earthquake is over. Many of the lifelines of Southern California have been disrupted. A large number of people are trapped in collapsed buildings. Over 1,600 fires start, some turning into super conflagrations. Millions of people are trying to use their phones, causing the system to become overloaded. In the months ahead, there will be tens of thousands of aftershocks. Residents will struggle to recover from the earthquake. There will be no water for weeks or months, and no electricity. Traveling from point to point within the city will be extremely difficult, and 255,000 people will be displaced from their homes. We are all in this together. We will suffer the consequences if we don't do our part right now. How quickly life gets back to normal after this disaster is up to you and those around you.
Yeah, that's enough of a challenge Kelly's offering. They're going to post it tomorrow on the website. You can get it through YouTube at Preparedness now. Right? So what I wanted to do, though, is this is the sum of this. Here's a video, another animation of what the shaking is going to be like. Remember I said that the length of the earthquake determines the magnitude. We assumed 200 miles of the San Andreas went in this earthquake. It could go farther. We stopped it here, so it's only a 7.8. And you can see how as the rupture moves up the fault, the shaking travels out from it. So you can have a long time from the beginning of the earthquake until the shaking actually gets to you. It's going to take 100 seconds for the rupture to move all the way up the San Andreas Fault. Okay? It's over 3 minutes that somewhere in Southern California is moving. And in any one location, the strong shaking goes from 20 to 50 seconds. If you are in a basin, the shaking gets trapped and it keeps on going for longer. So most of Orange County, most of the LA Basin, the San Fernando, the San Gabriel Valleys, the Coachella Valley, those are all places that are basically a big bowl of sand surrounded by hard rock. And as the shaking gets into that sand, it just reverberates back and forth. On the right, I'm showing an overview from Huntington Beach. So we're actually sitting, here's the 405 and the 55. We're sort of sitting here right now. And you see it's already a minute and a half into the earthquake before you really get the strong shaking here. But you still get strong shaking. And that's, again, the basin effect is amplifying the shaking. So when we look overall at Southern California, what we see is that all these basins where people tend to live are also places where we amplify the shaking. So what's different in these events is the scale. You know, one of the things I had to repeat over and over during my time in the City Hall, and I still don't think they believe me, was Northridge was not a big earthquake. That became my mantra. Northridge was not a big earthquake. The fault in Northridge was 10 miles across, and the shaking lasted for 7 seconds. This fault is 20 times as long, and that many more people are affected. All right? So, what does that do to a city? You guys know, you're a room where I don't have to go, this is what's underneath a city. Who knew, right? This is what we start when we build a city, is all of those pipes. And then we go and put our city on top of it, where we have many roads, a transportation network, we have homes, we have businesses, We have power plants, we have manufacturing, we have freeways, we have telecommunications, and we have a lot of people. To make this work, a city, a modern urban environment is a system of systems. You have a water system, you have a sewer system, you have an electrical system, you have a transportation system, and all of these systems need to work well enough to keep us moving. Right? So that's the core of this is how we approach this. We are not going to try to prevent all the earthquake damage. We probably could if we were willing to spend that much money, and we'd kill more people with other things because we weren't spending the money somewhere else. What we are trying to do is make sure we don't collapse. And that is one thing that my research has led me to believe is the collapse of our society. Very severe regional depression is a real possibility if things go badly and we don't deal with this. All right, so what does this mean? It means that there's a series of critical infrastructure that has to work well enough. Water is obviously one of them. There's also buildings, electricity, basic energy, and in a modern society, cell phones and internet, right? How would you run your businesses without any computer systems? We don't do that anymore. The problem is the last time we had a serious earthquake in Southern California was 3 months before the release of the first internet browser. The public internet did not exist in Northridge. So we really have to look elsewhere in the world to try and understand how it might be affected by what we're doing. All of these, we have these critical infrastructure, and then we have these other systems that are then dependent upon it. And I said, we're trying to keep it working well enough. It doesn't have to be complete. For instance, if you lose your building, you have people who can't go to work. But if you still have internet, they can telecommute. We can compensate for some extent as long as the other systems are okay. Or for instance, we lose our water pipes. If we have transportation, we can be trucking it in. We can get people water to drink for a while. FEMA has plans for trucking in an amazing amount of water in the event of a Southern California earthquake. This only works for so long. How many of you are willing to stay if you haven't had a shower in a month? Right? So, you know, it only takes us so far. And of course, then we've got our wild cards, not quite sure what's going to happen with internet and cell towers. I want to make the point that what is at stake when I say economic depression, I have a reason for saying this. If you look at what you expect in your economic activity in a region, over time you expect it to grow. When a disaster happens, you lose money, things are broken, but you also lose economic activity. There's no electricity, there's no water, the businesses don't reopen. Right? What we want is to get things back quickly enough that we can return to the level of economic activity we had before. If we can do that within a couple of years, we're in a pretty good shape. Now we actually call this the Northridge model. Right? We lost a lot of money in Northridge, but 40% of our population had earthquake insurance. I don't know who's willing to say, who has earthquake insurance in this room? I am impressed. This is a larger percentage. Overall, it's about 9%. Right? We are no longer going to have that big influx of money to help get things going. Right? And it doesn't have to happen this way. If we don't get things moving quickly enough, if we don't get people able to have showers, people leave. And once they leave, they're less likely to come back. And we could see a long-term depression in our economy. We sometimes call this the Katrina model, because if you actually look at what happened in New Orleans, you're going to see this. And the amount of money lost over those many years of depression can dwarf what happens in the event itself. This is the economic output of Nashville and New Orleans from 2000 to 2012. Before Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was bigger than Nashville. They lost $80 billion directly in the hurricane in the New Orleans area, but their GDP sank. And they've lost, in the 7 years after the hurricane, it's $105 billion reduced GDP. And they're continuing to lose at $15 billion a year. So this is what we're trying to prevent for Southern California. The way we want to do this is creating enough resilience that our society still functions. And we had 3 specific goals: keep people from dying in the earthquake, make sure we can respond to the earthquake, and give us the capacity to recover from the earthquake. So these are our objectives. We took all of this information about the shakeout scenario, and we looked at it in more detail about what's necessary to keep things functioning. Water is, of course, a core issue, and it's actually it's the largest dollar sign on the mayor's report by far. At least what the city's going to spend. When people have to retrofit their buildings, they're having to pick up the cost. But we are also making the argument, the city's going to pay for the water, the building owners pay for the buildings, the telecom companies help repair some of that stuff. We're all in this together, and we all have to do it together to make this thing work. When we look at previous earthquakes and what's happened in water supply, we see that the damage is caused by 3 main causes. One is earthquake shaking, and then the liquefaction caused by earthquake shaking. So when the ground really gets pretty soft, pipes have a hard time staying together. Broken water pipes in an earthquake, it's all over the world. We know that it's going to happen. Fault offset's another big one. Remember the picture of that rice paddy? We expect the San Andreas to move somewhere between 10 and 40 feet during the earthquake, different amounts on different parts of the fault. Right? Of our 4 major aqueducts coming into Southern California, we have 32 fault crossings. None of them will be functioning in this earthquake. If it's a San Andreas earthquake that really extends from the Salton Sea up to Fort Tejon, they're all gone. Right? And that's the most likely earthquake. It doesn't matter where the epicenter is. The epicenter is only where it starts. The point is how much of it's going. So what's life like with all the aqueducts gone? And then chemical accidents, actually contamination of the water starts getting pretty significant too. Short term, well, you guys know this, there's huge consequences to the damaged water supply. Nothing's really working. You guys know what's needed for repairs, and you can't, that's one of the interdependencies. We're also losing our freeways. How much chlorine do you guys need to bring in, and where does it come from? And you've now lost Interstate 15, Interstate 10, and maybe Interstate 5. Right? How do we get those supplies in there? How do you keep the people here that you need to do work? And how do you share the information that you need to share to get this to go on? And if we don't get it back, water actually probably has the biggest long-term consequences. It's one of the few places that we really look at the potential for mass evacuation and the loss of population. That just means we have a much bigger problem getting our overall business back up together. Right? If you look at what happened this is all from the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand in 2011, they had widespread liquefaction. They lost essentially their whole water system. Right? But there had been a pilot project that had gone on just before this, 2.5 kilometers of polyurethane pipes. I'm not sure of the details, right? They did not break at all. The rest of the system was gone. Right? There's also an example from Japan. They have a type of ductile iron pipe with O-rings. There's a great example from the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, the magnitude 9. When Tokyo Disney went in, they needed so much water they couldn't use the local water supply, so they had to put in their own water system. And they put it in with these ductile iron, these earthquake-resistant pipes, and they were laid in the same area as a traditional network of pipes because they had the 2 systems on top of each other. So they got the same shaking and the same earthquake, widespread breakage in the traditional system and none in the Disney system. So we know there are ways that you can build pipes to not break in earthquakes. And that's probably the biggest single issue about water. That's how people don't have the water in their houses. All of those issues that cause for a long delay. The business disruption model for shakeout, the loss of water accounted for $50 billion in business disruption. And that's assuming that every worker has stayed around and goes back to work the minute the water comes back. So Professor O'Rourke at Cornell has done a lot of studies on these pipes. Right? Then we have the aqueduct issue. As I said, you know, for LA, it's 88% comes from outside. The black line is the San Andreas Fault. The yellow dots are places where one of the aqueducts crosses the fault. For Los Angeles, they of course own the Los Angeles Aqueduct. It's the only aqueduct with only one fault crossing. Right? It crosses the fault in a 1908 wood tunnel that's 9 feet in diameter, where the fault offset's expected to be 12 feet. Right? So we know it won't work. One of the recommendations in the mayor's plan, DWP has 6 months to give their assessment of which engineering approach to re-engineer the aqueduct to survive the fault offset. It's due to the mayor in July. Okay, that's, yeah. The other thing about water is that fire, in our model, fire doubles the losses. And it was such a large loss that we compiled an expert panel of fire chiefs to look at what had gone into the modeling. And their conclusion was that we'd underestimated it. Right? And it includes losses of water that helps trigger, as you get out of control fires, you get super conflagrations. It happened in Tokyo in 1923. It happened in San Francisco in 1906. When you have a really big earthquake in a dense urban area, that's what you get. Right? Having a fire system that works, a firefighting water system that works, is incredibly important. I think I did the same sort of modeling, but I'm talking too long, so I'm going to go through this part. Let's get to the results. So here are the recommendations from the LA Mayor's report on what is needed to fortify the water system. And I think, yeah. First off is we are calling for an alternative firefighting system. San Francisco has one, Vancouver, British Columbia has one. We don't have complete details, it's very complicated. Again, DWP and the fire department have a year to give their plan to the mayor of how they want to put this together and what it's going to cost. We are looking at a multi-pronged system because nothing, you know, LA is just too big. We are looking at using seawater near the coast, having some pipes bringing seawater inland. That's what Vancouver does. We are looking at using reclaimed water. So as they're developing a purple pipe system out of Hyperion, and there's another treatment plant, they are looking at getting reclaimed water to be used for landscaping uses. We're saying use seismic resistant pipes to make it, and purple hydrants on the purple pipes. You now have an alternative system that's done with resilient piping. Right. Again, for Elizabeth Tunnel, that's up to LADWP. The next thing that we want to do is actually try to engage everybody else, because everybody in this room is going to have to deal with the loss of the aqueducts as well. Right? We all have a problem, and when people talk about the earthquake risk to our water system, they usually say the delta. The fact that we are going to lose all of our aqueducts in the same earthquake. That is the most likely scenario, guys. It's not, maybe we'll lose 2, we're going to lose them all. So what are we going to do about it? Right? It's not LA's job, but we all have a stake in it. So one of the things we're calling for, and the mayor's going to use what status he's got to try and pull this together, is to develop a consortium of the relevant jurisdictions, the water agencies, with MWD and DWR, and understand the scope of the problem and what we can do about it. And again, I pointed out about reclaimed water. The other thing is that the best defense against the broken aqueducts is to not need them. So what we can do to develop, and remember, in 100 years, we probably don't have a Sierra snowpack anymore. Any move to sustainability is also earthquake resilience. And the advantage of looking at that is you have very different constituents for sustainability and resilience. People who are worried about climate change and people who are worried about the next disaster are usually different people. And we can now get 2 constituencies supporting the same activity. Seismic resistant pipes, we've already talked about this. This is a picture of the Japanese pipe. I don't know how many of you have ever dealt with this Japanese manufacturer. They are interested in licensing the production of the pipes in California. So the LA Mayor's Office is interested in what they can do to work with other jurisdictions to bring the manufacturing here to California, cost effective for all of us, keep the jobs in California. The Mayor's Office is really interested in taking this. DWP obviously, but the Mayor's Office probably has more clout on that issue. We're going to start with the most strategic locations. What the plan says is we are committed to a future of seismic resistant pipes. And how long it's going to take us to get to that future is going to depend on the funding. It was one of the more interesting, this hasn't been a great year for DWP. I got told that politically the chances of getting a bond passed to give DWP more money was pretty slim. They're looking at other approaches about how to take that on. One of the discussions is the potential for having a statewide seismic resilience infrastructure bond. If we're going to go and invest money in our infrastructure, we cannot at this stage in our societal development justify building infrastructure that's not resistant to earthquakes. We know too much about what the problem is. And so the idea of trying to combine those together, the improvement to our infrastructures. And the other thing that I think is most significant potentially is executive order that doesn't cost any money at all, and that's that everything in the future in DWP will be reviewed for its impact on seismic resilience. They are committed to a seismic resilience by design program, reporting directly to the general manager, overseeing both water and power, with outside experts to help give them advice that from here on out, we don't build in any more problems. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time. That's probably the most important. I can give you a wrap up relatively quickly. Okay. Again, the same type of analysis. What happens to buildings? We shake them down, we burn them down, and we flood them, right, basically. Big consequence to our, to killing people, loss of shelter, jobs are closed. Repairing it is actually a really big deal. Do you know how much debris gets created by an earthquake? Getting rid of that debris is a huge issue. We actually did calculations of the amount of debris to be created in the shakeout thing, and it's like more than all of the existing landfills of California or something like that. And of course, the long-term consequences when we don't repair them, there's obviously the business disruption, but there's a lot of damage to everybody around you. You might think, and this is a core issue, we treat decisions about buildings as the owner's decision. If you choose to build a building so weak that it is completely unusable in the next earthquake, that is your financial choice to make. You just can't kill somebody in the process. So the building code is only the absolute minimum. Don't kill someone. Doesn't mean you can use it. Well, this has got some pretty big issues for us as a society. If we have a large number of our code-compliant buildings not being usable, and I'm trying to remember if I didn't put this in. An engineer I work with has done a big evaluation of the shakeout earthquake, what the building code is asking, and his estimate is that for the shakeout earthquake across the region, 99% of the code-compliant buildings won't collapse. Now, for your individual choice, 99% chance it won't collapse. That sounds pretty good. Why do you really want to build more than that? Well, but from the society's point of view, that means we're accepting that 1% of our brand new code-compliant buildings will collapse. We're accepting, there's 1 million buildings in LA. 1% collapsing is actually a lot of buildings. And besides that, if you look back at Northridge, for every collapsed building, we had 10 red-tagged buildings. So that means 10% of our new code-compliant buildings are red-tagged, completely unusable. And we had another 40 yellow-tagged buildings. You can't, limited use, you don't get to use, go in and get your stuff out type of thing. That means we're accepting 50% of our buildings, of our new buildings, not usable after the earthquake. How do you keep society running? Right? You really don't. And we have accepted this very low standard. And the problem is not only, it's as a community. We've got all these buildings we can't use, but also one of the other things we've seen when somebody has a badly damaged building, the building department is going to red tag the adjacent buildings because of the potential for collapsing onto them. In the Napa earthquake that happened last summer, they had adopted a mandatory retrofit for brick buildings, the unreinforced masonry, and only 3 were still not retrofitted. One owner didn't like government telling him what to do, and he was fighting them in court and paying his fine rather than fixing his buildings. All 3 of his buildings were badly damaged, but the buildings adjacent to his properties were also red tagged because of the potential of further collapse during the aftershocks. Or you go back to the Christchurch example in 2011, 70% of the buildings in their downtown business district were badly damaged. That's a very high number. 30% were fine, people that had retrofitted. All of them were closed because it was just too dangerous to go down the streets. Right? So when somebody doesn't retrofit their building or builds a shoddy building in some way, everybody around them can suffer. And of course their tenants don't get to go back to work or don't have a place to live and potentially lose their lives. You can't use the roads because of the debris that's gone into them. And in the long run, somebody has a bad building and rather than earthquake insurance, he had a really big mortgage and walks away from it. You've now got blight. And everybody's property values are going down. So the consequences of the decisions, in fact, affect all of us. This is the message I took to the mayor's office. We talked about a lot of aspects to it, and we came up with 5 main recommendations. And I don't have detailed slides about them. We are requiring mandatory retrofit of 2 really bad types of buildings. One is called soft first story. That's like the Northridge Meadows apartment that collapsed in 1994. It's a real killer. It's relatively simple to fix. The problem, and these are your dingbat apartments with little metal poles holding up the first floor. You slot in a full wall. They actually have modular units. They're only 4 inches across. It costs about $5,000 an apartment unit to give you really good resistance to this. Now, it doesn't make it as strong as a modern building, but it brings it up to other buildings of a similar age without the defect. Right? So we're requiring mandatory retrofit of those. We think it's about 13,000 to 15,000 such buildings in LA. It's a lot of buildings. The council, all right, so the mayor's report, we said this is what you should do. But this has to be done by city council. The LA mayor actually doesn't have a whole lot of power. And it's city council that'll need to pass that. And the approach that the mayor's office took, I thought was odd at the beginning, but I'm realizing it's really brilliant. They said, this is what needs to be done. And here are some incentives that were suggested during the process of talking with all of our stakeholders. Hey, city council, how do you want to structure a plan? What it means is city council has to work at this. They have to get invested in it. They come up with solutions. If we had come along and said, here's the ordinance you should pass, we'd have a lot of reason to push back at us. Instead, we said, this is the science. What's your policy for addressing it? Now people are invested in creating the solutions. And it's working. We don't have opposition in city council. Almost all the ordinances they're being submitted 1 each week. They've also submitted an ordinance to use PACE financing, property assessed clean energy financing. So it's money put up by the private sector, but you pay it back through your property assessment, so it's a very secure investment. You get good rates on it. We've got an ordinance to use PACE financing for seismic retrofitting, so that's going through. The concrete buildings are things like the Olive View Hospital that collapsed in the '71 earthquake. This is a much more challenging issue. For one thing, you can't stand on the outside and see it's a bad building. You see a apartment building with open parking on the first floor and those little poles, you know it's a bad building. You see a concrete building, it might be tied together really well and be fine. it might be the most deadly type of building on this planet during an earthquake. And you need a structural engineer to tell you which one it is. So what we're proposing is that owners will have 5 years to do the assessment and figure out whether they've got a problem. The reason we're giving that much time for the assessment, there's only so many structural engineers in Southern California, but also FEMA is funding some important studies. We think that by 2017 we're going to have a better approach for assessing the buildings that are going to let more of them off the hook and potentially have some more cost-effective retrofitting approaches. So we want to make sure we can take advantage of that. And then we're giving them 25 years to actually get it done. The rationale here is it's a lot more expensive. It's about 3 to 6 months rent in the apartments in these concrete buildings. It's more like 5 years worth of rent to do the retrofitting. You have to kick out your tenants to do it. So we want to make it, they don't have to violate a long-term lease. We want to give them time to be able to do that. We were originally talking 20 years. BOMA asked for 25 and said then they wouldn't oppose it. We went, fine, you got 25. BOMA is on board. We got a letter from the Building Owners and Management Association supporting this. The LA Conservancy is on board. The apartment owners of Greater Los Angeles are on board. I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people this last year, and we aren't getting the opposition to this in spite of them being mandatory. We're also asking for a voluntary rating system. And this is the basic concept. If I go and look at a building, I have a pretty decent idea of what sort of building it is. Not because I'm an engineer, I'm not, but I've been exposed to enough information. I see a 1920s concrete building and I'm not renting it, at least not till I've got a really good structural engineers association, evaluation. 1997 wood frame house, I'll be in there and just do anything. And because of the changes in the building code and different types of construction. I know this. Shouldn't everybody be able to get this information? It's not rocket science, as they say, right? It's not that hard. But if we went and forced everybody to do a formal rating, for one thing, they'd have to hire a structural engineer and spend a lot of money. Remember that million buildings I was talking about? We could be spending billions just on rating, and that doesn't really make sense. But it does make sense for people to use this. So the city, we want the discussion to start. So the city is endorsing a rating system that's been developed by the structural engineers called the U.S. Resiliency Council. If you want to know what your building is, you can hire one of them. They have an approach that you can take to say, this building's probably falling down and is potentially really deadly, or this one is, go through anything. Very few things, though, will go through anything, because as I said, the modern code says don't kill people. It does not say be usable. And I will tell you that people who understand this, like USC, they have not built a building just to code since Northridge. They, at a minimum, add 25% to the required strength. Caltech adds 50%. People who are building to own and understand it think it's a really bad investment to build just to the code. Right? Our goal, the city is committing to rating all of its own buildings and disclosing the information. So there is going to be a public posting of the ratings on the city's buildings when they can figure out what buildings they all have. It turned out when we tried to get a list of the buildings, we got an estimate between 800 and 2,000, which is a pretty big range. So there's some time that this is going to take, but the mayor is committed to getting this to go through. I want to try and just wrap up with the last thing. I'm not going to do this again either. Communication networks can get damaged in a lot of ways. Big impact on a modern, modern urban economy. What we looked at, we had to go look at, because I said we don't have experience in California. We looked in other countries and we looked at other disasters. And there's a pretty clear picture that the biggest risk to our communications is congestion. That's not a big surprise to anybody. To deal with this, we spent a lot of time with the telecom companies. One of the things that came out of it, there are MOUs between the 4 major providers and the city where they are agreeing, the city agrees to facilitate them getting in and repairing their equipment during an emergency. In exchange, they're going to open up their bandwidth. So if Verizon's tower is down and AT&T is up, the Verizon customers are going to be able to use the AT&T, or whichever way I said it. They're going to be able to use each other's bandwidth. Turns out they can do that with their computers. You don't have to do anything in your phone. And then they're also going to open up their Wi-Fis, because texting through Wi-Fi is a real viable option when the cell phone towers are potentially not working. The second biggest problem is the lack of power. Now, we didn't directly address power. We sort of came around and said, boy, we really should have. Resilient power is a big deal. And one of the things that we are asking out of this is a second consortium. So we want to get the regional jurisdictions and utilities to deal with some of the issues, because some of the big risks to our power system come from the fact of how much power has to come into the region across the San Andreas Fault, just like the water. And the fault crossing issues, especially in some of our constrained corridors like Cajon Pass. So what we are asking for is to get together Edison, Sempra, LADWP, all of the utility providers and local jurisdictions to look at this issue. And actually, we're saying let's start with Cajon Pass as a pilot project. Edison's already on board. We've got a meeting coming up at the end of the month at Edison, starting this process. So again, this is something where we're going to be reaching out to all regional governments that have a stake in this to try and deal with this, because some of the estimates are very, very grim, where we could be without power for months. You know, and instead of having rolling blackouts, we'd have rolling startups. You know, you get power at 3 to 5 in the afternoon, and these lucky people get it at 3 to 5 in the morning. That may be what's needed because of how limited our amount will be. And then the last one, turns out our cell towers are built to the same standard as our buildings, life safety. Who do you know that lives in a cell phone tower? And yet that's our standard for the buildings. So we are asking that cell phone towers be treated as critical facilities and be built what's an importance factor of 1.5. Not for, you know, one of the problems, 50% of our towers are on buildings, and generally on older buildings, because they're the ones who need the rent. Those could be gone. So we're doing this only for freestanding towers and only for new towers, but let's move towards a more resilient structure. So that's what the plan is. Some of it is executive order and has already begun. I said DWP's been tasked with several projects to come up with more information. Some of them are ordinances from council. Those are underway. Some of them really are going to be about funding, and especially on the water side. Replacing those pipes and dealing with the fault crossings are relatively expensive actions. And that's going to be the biggest challenge, is how to find the money to move forward. But at least we've got a picture for how to do it. So thank you.
I know as unaccustomed you are to taking questions from people. She's been heckled by experts, so don't worry about it. But I'm going to take the point of asking the first question. One of the proposals was alternative fire system and running a pipeline into the ocean to bring in salt water. Are the permitting agencies okay with that?
Yeah, we're going to need to work with the Coastal Commission on this one. And we are aware of that. But actually, the easiest way to do it, and what might form the backbone, is to use the existing drainages. We have a network of right-of-ways through our flood control channels that go from the ocean at a place where we aren't really as worried about some of the coastal issues. And we could be running the pipes up the drainage channels. So that's one concept. We can get within, I think it's within 1 mile of 40% of the city by using all of the drainage channels. That's relatively expensive. We aren't sure how far we're going to go. The other big issue, you need to have power and pumps, and we're losing the electricity, so it's got to be backup power. And so that's why we want to get an evaluation of the different possible approaches.
One of the issues in Orange County we run into in emergency control is when there's an emergency, if we try to run, say, a diesel generator when there's a blackout, AQMD says, no, you can't do that. So,
right.
So I guess what I'm saying, some other disasters you may want to take a look at are Sacramento, AQMD, but anyways, okay. Any questions? Let's wait for the microphone.
Thank you for a wonderful talk and
Thank
a very
you.
timely one. A lot of us come from coastal cities, and their economies are vitally dependent on tourists. And at any day of the week of the month, whatever, we'll have a large number of people in our city or service area. Was there anything from your work that gave clues or hints, or what do we do with these people who are kind of stranded?
Right. Yeah, the tourists are definitely an issue. The one good news, while we lose all of our roads, we don't lose very much of our airports. For the San Andreas earthquake, at least, LAX, John Wayne, and Long Beach are all at low enough levels of shaking. We don't expect to see them shut down for very long. So, rule number one: get rid of as many of them as you can. And they're probably wanting to go by this point. So that's one aspect of it. We actually spent, this actually isn't the only scenario we've done. We did a tsunami scenario as well. Actually, we were using an Alaskan source, so a big Pacific tsunami. But, we estimated 90,000 people, basically tourists in shops at any moment on a weekday along the coast. And one of the things to be done with that is really to be working with our retail community about how to work with them. Now, in general, it's a hard topic to bring up. A lot of people in the retail tourist industry don't want to be talking about the disasters because that tends to have a problem with keeping the tourists here. What we've found, though, is that the tourists often are happy to get it. And that hotels, for instance, that have in their books, what do you do during an earthquake, haven't lost customers over it. And so I think in the long run of the resilience for the region, it's something we really need to do, of how to support, how to make the tourists feel safer, because it is going to happen at some point. So it's a challenging issue. I don't have an immediate solution on this, but it is it's something that LA was talking about, because their tourist industry is also a pretty significant part of the city. Other questions? Oh, the microphone's over there, yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Barbara Delglaze. I'm a newly elected city councilwoman in Huntington Beach. I've been a long-time fan of yours, and I'm thrilled to hear you tonight. I'm a coastal city. I'm just curious, based on your dire thoughts about water, if you were a city council person in a local coastal area now, what would you recommend as far as storage or suggestions along those lines? Because obviously there's going to be other issues, but if we have storage of some kind, that might be able to help us. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I love Huntington Beach. My son is student teaching at Ocean View High School, so I get down there. Storage, obviously we need to do storage, but we can't deal with this problem through storage. If we lose, the other thing is, so I don't know how many of you know Craig Davis, who's at DWP. He led the DWP analysis. He went through, actually as part of his Ph.D. thesis at USC, went into looking at what it would take to repair all the aqueducts, and he thinks it's going to take 18 months to get everything back online. We don't have storage at that level. We can't, right? And I think we absolutely have to deal with the aqueduct problem, and we can't get around that. The broken pipe problem, we can't afford to replace all the pipe right now, right? So we can hope that we get some smaller earthquakes along the way where the scale will be fixable before we get to this one, I guess. I think there isn't a short-term fix, and that's hard politically. Though I was really interested in the aftermath of releasing this report. There was an editorial in some downtown LA publication about why politicians never deal with earthquake issues. And they said, if you go and invest, as a politician, you go say you want to do, elected official goes and says, we got to deal with this. Well, either there won't be an earthquake before you're out of office, and then people are going to say, why did you spend that money? Or there will be an earthquake before you get out of office, and you won't have had time for your improvements to take effect, so you'll have looked ineffective. And that this was a no-win situation for any elected official. and then proceeded to then praise Mayor Garcetti for being willing to take action on something that he wasn't getting any political credit for. So he got political credit for doing work on something that didn't have political credit. And I was realizing, you know, in fact, he was a pretty smart politician in that sense, and he's getting lots of credit for tackling that difficult issue. And I guess I hope other elected officials can look at that and go, maybe it isn't deadly to tackle this. Even though it's a difficult problem, it takes a really long time, it's going to take some money, and we need. One of the other things I said as I talked with all of the people in LA over the last year, we are trying to protect the economy of Southern California, and we can't protect the economy after the earthquake by destroying it before. So we have to be reasonable about what it is that we think that we should be spending, but we can't ignore it either. So, you know, I think we encourage people to continue to have water storage at home on the individual level. You know, some level of storage. I mean, you guys must have storage locally to some extent. Whether or not extending that makes sense on a city scale, I don't know. Doing something about your pipes does make sense. If nothing else but a commitment in the future when a pipe is replaced, don't replace it with another pipe that we know is going to break. Replace it with one that's going to survive the earthquake, and eventually we'll get to the resilience that we need.
I'll just take a point of privilege as a Met director. We're very proud of the Laverne facility, and I don't know if you've been there, where we can manufacture pipe of any size in our system to replace it in times of earthquake and emergencies. We also have Diamond Valley Lake, which is a 6-month supply of water, which is very helpful. It's in basin, it's not around any faults. We think most of the faults come out of Sacramento and DC at this point. But at the end of the day, everybody in this room is working towards that, because we know how critical that infrastructure is and the ability of responding right away. In fact, at Met, we're dealing with the issue with the aqueduct, Colorado River Aqueduct, coming across the faults, and we know what we need to do, and we're prepared and ready to do it. Well, so we think about 6 months. The system will be down, in worst case scenario, the Colorado system.
Yeah, look at Craig's stuff. He goes 12 months on Colorado, I think. Though I might be wrong. There's one that's 6, there's one that's 12, and there's one that's 18, and I can't remember which one it is.
One 6, yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good news. And the other thing, though, is that we are getting political support on this. Nobody's fighting us in LA. And I think that means that this is a potential opportunity where you can go and talk with your constituents, and you might get more support for moving forward on this than you would at another time. And you're right. I mean, what you guys know what the problem is. Here we've got a chance to help other people understand what the problem is and be willing to do something about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I had the opportunity to hear you speak at UCI, and it terrified me.
Thank you.
Same idea here that we're all waking up to. I do have my water storage in my little buckets of food. But my real question today, I'm from Laguna Beach. We are very concerned that last August the government said that stranded nuclear fuel, 1,632 tons, is allowed to stay for 60 to 140 years at San Onofre in dry storage casks. I understand the wet storage is extremely dangerous, but the dry storage, do you have a comment? I hope we can move it out of here.
Well, you need to have a place to move it to.
Yes.
And that's where the society hasn't been able to come together on that. And so I think supporting something like Yucca Mountain.
The biggest part that I forgot, what we are hoping is an interim solution, because of the litigation on Yucca could be with hundreds of, lots of years. We are hoping to ask for a California interim, just for California, in an isolated military base, so that we would get it out of the earthquake zone on the coast. Is that a...
That it makes sense. I hadn't heard that one yet, but I can understand that. You better pick which base pretty carefully.
We don't get to pick.
And I will say, I don't know if this will help you, but Compared to the earthquake risks in other parts of the state, San Onofre is not the top of my worry list, if that's any help. Diablo Canyon's a lot scarier. So, on that.
Okay, any more questions? Let's see. You okay for one more? Okay, well, one more, last question.
I can do more if you want, but I promise you guys might not list.
No, I love this.
Hi, Lucy. This is Lyndon. I worked with you on the Seismic Safety Commission about 12, 15 years ago, California Seismic Safety. I'm now a chairperson of the Torrance Water Commission, and I have a question. Thank you very much for your fantastic and your passion for public safety, continuous. I have a question on water mains, and you talked about the aqueducts, which is very apropos, the aqueduct, the seismic resilience of the aqueduct. But then within the city, we have hundreds of miles of water mains.
Right.
These water mains are mostly, at least in the city of Torrance, are replaced with ductile iron pipe. The original was cast iron pipe, and they rupture about 4 or 5 a month. So we have about 50 water main breaks a month, even without an earthquake.
Right.
And so in LA, there must be about 1,000 water main breaks based on that. And
Yeah, they have
therefore-
3 a day.
and therefore, I think I estimated about 30 billion gallons of waters are lost, including the one at UCLA, as you mentioned. Do you not have a program? The water is the most important thing. We can't live without water. We can live without energy, perhaps, with other things, but water is basic. Do you not have a program, a prioritized, programmatic, proactive retrofit program of these water mains at strategic locations, using like you mentioned, the hazard-resistant ductile iron pipe that you mentioned that survived the Tohoku earthquake in 1911?
Yes, one of the recommendations, and I got back a little too far, is seismic-resistant pipes. The city's, this recommendation in the mayor's report is a commitment to a future that will eventually be all resilient pipes. And there's going to be and depending on, but this is going to depend on funding, how fast we can move forward on this. So it's going to be somewhere between just doing future replacements with seismic resistant pipe to some amount of more proactive switching out in the most critical mains. So they're developing a prioritization for which of the pipes whose breaking would cause the most problem, and would be upgrading on that part. So there was a 6-month process with DWP that involved about 10 or 15 of their engineers to come up with this plan, and that is part of it. I can actually take a couple, I mean, you guys are the ones who are sitting there, I'm willing to take some more.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, hi, thanks for the great
Sure.
presentation. There was an article recently, I think today, about some federal support for early warning systems.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, I know that Caltech and others have been studying all of the seismic activity at the park field. And do you think that early warning systems are a viable part of the solution?
Okay, early warning works. Prediction doesn't, and they're different. Okay, so prediction is before the earthquake begins, which, by the way, I started it up again, so we'll sort of think about how long it's taking for this to happen. Prediction is before the earthquake begins, trying to get evidence of that. The problem is the magnitude 7 begins the same way as the magnitude 2. And we have 30 to 50 earthquakes every day in California. So what happens before an earthquake happens every day. And as far as we can tell, the Earth doesn't have information in it before the earthquake begins about how big it's going to be. So we have no way to correlate predicting the magnitude of the earthquake, which is really all you want. You don't want me to predict every earthquake. As I said, there'll be one before you go to sleep tonight. But early warning is taking the seismic network we already have, right? When you hear there's been an earthquake, there's a 3.2 at Marina del Rey. That is our seismic network recording the waves coming out from that earthquake and calculating where and when the earthquake must have begun to give us those patterns of waves. What we're doing with early warning is doing that so quickly that we get you that information before the waves themselves arrive. So if you go back to this, at the beginning of the earthquake, when we're at like 3 seconds from the beginning of the earthquake, if we had a bunch of seismic stations down here by the Salton Sea, we would know that this earthquake's already begun. And we would know that it's on the San Andreas. And in fact, we do have those stations. And we have a prototype. And we are sending that information. I have it on my computer. Actually, if we had had an earthquake, I've got it on this computer. We would have heard, well, except for we aren't hearing the sound. And we're working on the algorithms. We've been investing in the research on it for quite a few years, so we've got a working prototype. What we need is to get enough stations in enough locations, because how quickly you get the information depends on how many stations you have. More stations closer, you can do that more quickly. And here in Southern California, we actually have enough stations to go live. A lot of it was an investment by the city of Los Angeles before I started. This is sort of part of why we had the connections. $6 million of UASI money, Urban Area Security Initiative money, was given to Caltech to install, to buy and install 125 new stations. And it was completed last August. So we now have over 400 stations in Southern California that are digital that we can use for early warning. And we're doing pretty well. The Yorba Linda earthquake in 2012, we had 4 seconds warning in Pasadena. Actually, the La Habra earthquake, I think we had 8 seconds in Pasadena. Now, if you were in La Habra, you'd maybe get a very tiny amount. Oops, earthquake, oop, yep, there it went, right? And that's all you'd get because you're right on top of it. With this really big earthquake, you've got 80 seconds before the strong shaking gets over here, right? So, and part of it is you have to recognize that it's a big earthquake. Remember, they all start the same? So you've got to watch that it's moving up the San Andreas. We now have enough stations along the San Andreas and the San Jacinto to catch those big ones. And we have a new approach where we can calculate how big the earthquake is, so we're getting much more accurate and where the fault is, because it's not just the epicenter. You got to understand the fault to predict what the shaking's going to be. We've got it in place. The $5 million was just, so $5 million was in the Congress's, they added it to our appropriation. The problem with congressionally added money is it's one-time money. It's hard to hire people on it. So we're getting some term appointments, and we're buying a lot of instruments for Northern California and the Pacific Northwest that didn't have the LA investment. But the president has just requested adding that $5 million to our base budget, so it'd be every year, and we could really start getting the staff that's needed to keep things going. The relationship between the president and Congress is such that we're calling this an aspirational budget. We hope that that part at least gets kept, because Congress did give it to us this year. So it's real. It's not Parkfield. It's not prediction. It's realizing that an earthquake's begun before the shaking gets to you. We have the prototype working. We have the stations here. One of our the first hire that I've got to do as a term appointment, since it's not permanent money yet, is an educational coordinator to start figuring out how we put together a program for the public so that they can understand the information. Because this is going to be a warning, strong shaking in 3 seconds, or at best strong shaking in 50 seconds. What are you going to do with that? Right? Under the table, right? And all right, now what if you were in an unreinforced masonry building? Would you change your ag? And you have 50 seconds? Yeah, except for that's a rather complicated message. How do you, right? And a lot of what we hope to do with it would be automatic. So your elevator in this hotel could receive the message, move to the nearest floor and open the door. And you wouldn't be caught in an elevator during an earthquake. You could ring an alarm in an operating room or a dentist's office, so the surgeon pulls the knife out of your chest before the shaking comes through. Yeah, right? And actually automated processes. What could you guys do in water systems? Is there something that would be worth shutting down in your clarifiers or in some part of your processing? Is there something that moving during the earthquake will cause more damage? right? There's a lot of processes which that is true of. So like chip manufacturers in Japan have been using this and saving a lot of money in some big earthquakes. Every train in Japan will be stopped before the shaking gets to them. No train was moving during the magnitude 9 because they have an operational system. Right? So there's a lot that can be done. Only some of it is personal. I'm talking a lot, but I'll end with this note on this. In Japan, actually very few people got the message personally before Tohoku. They did a big education campaign. Nobody seemed to notice. Some people had it, most don't. In the month after the Tohoku earthquake, there was 1 million downloads of the phone app in Tokyo. And what people found was that the psychological benefit dealing with aftershocks, oh, it's going to be a magnitude 5, oh, it's not going to be that bad. Oh, yeah, strong shaking to arrive, or no, weak shaking to arrive. You know that feeling when an earthquake begins and you go, oh God, how big is it going to be? Oh, okay, it wasn't that bad, right? Imagine knowing before that happens that it's not going to be that bad. In an aftershock sequence when you're getting that every day. And it turned out to be a huge psychological benefit. And we're actually working with social scientists about how to create the message in such a way that it'll do the most good.